The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the small cemetery outside Tombstone, casting long shadows between the weathered headstones. Eleanor Morrison knelt beside the freshest grave, her black dress absorbing the heat like a furnace. 6 months had passed since they'd buried James, but the pain still cut through her chest with every breath. "Should have known better than to trust them savages," came a voice behind her. Eleanor didn't need to turn around to recognize the gravelly tone of Sheriff Tom Bradley. "Your husband brought this on himself, Eleanor. Everyone knows it." She kept her eyes fixed on the simple wooden cross marking James's resting place. "My husband was a good man, Sheriff. He treated everyone with respect." "Respect?" Bradley spat into the dust. "That's what got him killed. Feeding them Apache dogs, giving them water, treating their wounds. Might as well have painted a target on his back." Eleanor finally stood, her knees stiff from kneeling on the hard ground. When she turned, she saw Bradley wasn't alone. 3 other men from town stood behind him. Pete Garrison from the general store, Luke Matthews, who ran the saloon, and young Billy Crawford, who worked at the livery stable. Their faces wore the same mixture of contempt and righteousness that had become all too familiar since James's death. "What do you want, Sheriff?" Eleanor's voice remained steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "Just making sure you understand how things stand," Bradley said, adjusting his gun belt. "Your husband's dead because he forgot which side he was on. Don't make the same mistake." Pete Garrison stepped forward, his merchant's smile twisted into something ugly. "We've been talking, Mrs. Morrison, about how you're managing out there all alone. Might be time to consider selling that ranch. Moving back east where you belong." "That ranch is my home," Eleanor said firmly. "James and I built it together. I'm not leaving." "Suit yourself," Matthews drawled, pulling a plug of tobacco from his shirt pocket. "But don't expect any help from town when them Apaches come calling again. Your husband learned the hard way what happens to Indian lovers." The words hung in the air like a curse. Eleanor felt her composure beginning to crack, 6 months of grief and isolation pressing down on her shoulders. "James was murdered," she whispered. "Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "Sure does," Bradley said with a cold smile. "Means one less fool in the territory." As if to punctuate his words, Matthews leaned over and spat directly onto James's grave. The brown stream of tobacco juice splattered across the wooden cross, and Eleanor felt something break inside her chest. "How dare you?" she breathed, but the men were already walking away, their laughter echoing across the cemetery. Eleanor dropped to her knees beside the grave, pulling a handkerchief from her pocket to clean the cross. Tears she'd been holding back for months finally came, hot and bitter against her cheeks. "I'm sorry, James," she whispered to the wooden marker. "I'm so sorry they did this to you." The sun was beginning to set by the time she composed herself enough to stand. The cemetery felt different in the gathering dusk, shadows stretching like grasping fingers between the graves. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and began the long walk back to her horse. She didn't notice the figure watching her from the ridge above the cemetery. Naalnish had been tracking the white men's horses for miles, following them to this place of the dead. He'd intended to scout their movements, to understand their patterns and weaknesses. Instead, he'd witnessed something that stirred an unexpected emotion in his chest. The Apache warrior remained motionless as the white woman mounted her horse and rode away into the deepening twilight. Below him, the desecrated grave stood as a monument to the hatred that poisoned both their peoples. Naalnish had participated in the raid that killed her husband, had watched James Morrison fall beneath Apache arrows. But he'd also seen the man's final moments, seen him push his wife towards safety, even as death claimed him. Among Naalnish's people, respect for the dead was sacred. Even enemies deserved honor in death. What the white men had done here violated something fundamental, something that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. As full darkness settled over the cemetery, Naalnish made his way down from the ridge. He moved like a shadow between the graves, his moccasins silent on the packed earth. When he reached James Morrison's resting place, he knelt and examined the wooden cross, still stained with the sheriff's contempt. From his quiver, Naalnish drew a single arrow. He planted it firmly in the ground beside the grave, then another and another. Through the long hours of the night, he worked methodically, creating a perfect circle of 300 arrows around the white man's final resting place. Each arrow represented a prayer for the dead, a guardian against those who would defile sacred ground. When dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Naalnish stood back to survey his work. The circle of arrows stood like silent sentinels, their obsidian points glinting in the early light. It was a message that would be understood by Apache and white man alike. This ground was protected, this dead man honored. Naalnish melted back into the desert as the first rays of sun touched the cemetery. By the time the townspeople discovered what had happened during the night, the Apache warrior was already miles away, but the consequences of his actions would echo through the territory like thunder rolling across the mountains. The scream that pierced the morning air could be heard clear across Tombstone. Mrs. Abigail Fletcher, the preacher's wife, had gone to the cemetery early to tend her mother's grave, and instead found something that sent her running back to town faster than her aging legs had moved in 20 years. Sheriff Bradley was still nursing his morning coffee when she burst through his office door, her face pale as fresh snow. Sheriff Bradley, you need to come quick. The cemetery." "Oh, Lord, the cemetery." "Calm down, woman," Bradley growled, setting down his cup. "What's got your petticoats in a twist?" "Arrows," she gasped, clutching her chest. "Hundreds of them, all around that Morrison fellow's grave. The Apaches. They've been there." Bradley's expression darkened instantly. He grabbed his hat and gun belt, shouting for his deputy as he headed for the door. Within minutes, half the town was following him toward the cemetery, word spreading like wildfire through the dusty streets. Eleanor Morrison heard the commotion from her ranch 3 miles out of town. She'd been mending a bridle on her front porch when the sound of galloping horses and shouting voices carried on the desert wind. Something cold settled in her stomach as she recognized the direction they were heading. By the time she reached the cemetery, a crowd of nearly 50 people had gathered. They stood in a wide circle around James's grave, their voices a mixture of fear, anger, and morbid fascination. Eleanor pushed through the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs. What she saw took her breath away. 300 arrows stood in perfect formation around James's grave, their shafts straight as soldiers at attention, their obsidian and steel points catching the morning sunlight like stars. The circle was precise, mathematical in its perfection, each arrow exactly the same distance from its neighbors and from the wooden cross at the center. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered behind her. "Look at all of them." Sheriff Bradley stood at the edge of the arrow circle, his face flushed with rage. "This is a declaration of war," he announced to the crowd. "Them savages are telling us they can come and go as they please, right here in our cemetery, right here where our dead are buried." "What does it mean?" asked Doc Hayes, the town physician. He was one of the few men present who didn't look ready to grab a rifle. "I've never seen anything like this." "It means they're marking their territory," Bradley spat, "claiming this ground as theirs. Well, I'll be damned if I let that stand." Eleanor found herself stepping forward before she fully realized what she was doing. "Wait," she said, her voice carrying further than she'd intended. The crowd turned to look at her, and she felt the weight of their stares. Maybe it means something different." "Different how?" Bradley's eyes narrowed dangerously. Eleanor approached the edge of the arrow circle, studying the precise formation. Something about it felt deliberate, purposeful in a way that went beyond simple intimidation. "Among some tribes," she said slowly, remembering conversations she'd had with James about Apache customs, "circles are protective, sacred." "You suggesting them savages are protecting your husband's grave?" Matthews laughed harshly. "Lady, they're the ones who killed him." "I know that," Eleanor said quietly, but she continued to study the arrows. Each one was different, she realized. Different wood, different points, different fletching, as if they'd been gathered from many warriors, many hunts, many battles. "But this took hours. Someone spent the entire night here. Why would they do that just to threaten us?" "Because they're savages," Bradley said flatly, "and the only thing savages understand is force." He turned to address the crowd. "I want every man with a gun to meet at my office in 1 hour. We're going to send a message these Apaches won't forget." "Sheriff, wait," Doc Hayes interjected. "If we go charging off into the desert looking for Apaches, we'll likely get ourselves killed. And for what? Some arrows stuck in the ground? For the principle of the thing." Bradley's voice rose. "We let this stand, and next week they'll be dancing around our children's graves. Next month they'll be burning down the church." The crowd murmured agreement, fear and anger feeding on each other. Eleanor watched men she'd known for years, men who'd shared meals at her table and helped raise her barn, transform into something ugly and dangerous. "I want them gone," she said suddenly. The crowd fell silent. "The arrows, I want them removed from my husband's grave." Bradley smiled with satisfaction. "Now you're talking sense, Eleanor. Boys, start pulling them." "No." Eleanor's voice cut through his words like a blade. "I'll remove them myself, alone." "Ma'am, that's not safe," young Billy Crawford spoke up. "What if they come back? What if they're watching?" Eleanor looked around the circle of faces, seeing the same mixture of fear and hatred that had driven them to desecrate James's grave in the first place. "Then let them watch," she said. "This is between me and whoever did this." As the crowd reluctantly began to disperse, Eleanor remained at the edge of the arrow circle. The morning sun was climbing higher, and the desert heat was already beginning to build. She knelt beside the first arrow, studying its craftsmanship. The shaft was smooth river birch, the point a beautifully knapped piece of obsidian that caught the light like black glass. She grasped the arrow and pulled it from the earth. It came free easily, as if it had been placed rather than driven deep. As she held it in her hands, she felt an unexpected reverence for the skill that had created it, the time and care that had gone into its making. One by one, she began to remove the arrows, working methodically around the circle. The sun climbed higher, and sweat began to soak through her dress. But she continued. There was something meditative about the work, something that calmed the storm of emotions that had been raging inside her since James's death. She was halfway around the circle when she sensed she was being watched. The feeling was subtle at first, like a whisper at the edge of consciousness, but it grew stronger as she continued working. Eleanor forced herself not to look up, not to scan the ridges and rock formations that surrounded the cemetery. If someone was watching, she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear. When she finally pulled the last arrow from the ground, Eleanor stood surrounded by neat bundles of arrows, organized by type and craftsmanship. The sun was directly overhead now, and her water bottle was nearly empty. James's grave looked strangely naked without its protective circle, vulnerable in a way that made her chest ache. As she began loading the arrows into her wagon, Eleanor made a decision that would have consequences she couldn't yet imagine. Instead of destroying them or turning them over to Sheriff Bradley, she would take them home. They represented something she didn't fully understand yet, but something that felt important, sacred even. The Apache warrior who had been watching from the distant ridge saw her careful handling of his work, saw the respect with which she treated each arrow. For the first time since the raid that had taken her husband's life, Naalnish felt something other than the bitter taste of regret in his mouth. Perhaps understanding was possible, even between enemies. 3 days after removing the arrows, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep. The bundles lay stacked in her barn, carefully organized, just as she'd arranged them at the cemetery. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw their perfect circle around James's grave and heard her husband's voice telling her about Apache customs he'd learned from the peaceful bands that sometimes traded at their ranch. "They don't waste effort on meaningless gestures, Ellie," James had told her once. "Every action has purpose, every symbol carries weight." The pre-dawn darkness was still thick when Eleanor finally gave up on sleep. She dressed quietly and made her way to the barn, lighting a lantern to examine the arrows more closely. In the flickering light, she could see details she'd missed before, carved symbols on some shafts, different styles of fletching, points made from materials ranging from obsidian to trade metal to carefully shaped bone. These weren't just weapons. They were works of art, each one representing hours of skilled craftsmanship. The person who had placed them around James's grave had sacrificed something valuable, something personal. Eleanor was so absorbed in her examination that she didn't hear the soft footsteps approaching the barn. It wasn't until a shadow fell across the lantern light that she realized she was no longer alone. She looked up to find an Apache warrior standing in the barn doorway. Her breath caught in her throat, but she forced herself to remain still. He was tall and lean, his dark hair streaked with early gray, his face marked by the harsh lines that desert sun and hard living carved into a man's features. He wore traditional buckskin leggings and a simple cloth shirt with a knife at his belt but no visible rifle. For a long moment they simply stared at each other across the barn. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, but something in the warrior's posture told her he hadn't come to harm her. He stood with his hands visible, his stance alert, but not aggressive. "You are the woman whose husband died," he said finally, his English heavily accented but clear. Eleanor found her voice. "You're the one who placed the arrows." It wasn't a question, and he didn't deny it. Instead, he stepped further into the barn, moving with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in his own body. "Your people dishonored his resting place." "I know." The admission came easier than Eleanor had expected. "I'm sorry they did that." Naalnish studied her face in the lantern light, searching for deception or fear. He found neither. "You removed my arrows with respect. You did not break them or burn them. They were beautiful," Eleanor said simply. "It seemed wrong to destroy something so carefully made." "Your husband," Naalnish said, moving closer to examine the bundled arrows. "He gave water to my nephew when the boy was dying of fever, fed him, treated his wounds, asked for nothing in return." Eleanor's breath caught. She remembered that day 3 years ago. James had found the young Apache collapsed near their waterhole, burning with infection from a badly set broken leg. Despite her fears, he'd brought the boy to their ranch and nursed him back to health over 2 weeks before the boy's family came to retrieve him. "That was your nephew, my sister's son. He lived because of your husband's kindness." Naalnish's voice carried a weight of something Eleanor couldn't quite identify. "When the warriors rode against your ranch, I tried to speak against it, but I was overruled. The anger was too strong, the hunger for revenge too great." "You were there," Eleanor said quietly, "when James died." "Yes." The single word carried more pain than a dozen speeches. "I watched him fall. I watched him push you towards safety, even as the arrows found him. He died protecting you." Eleanor felt tears she thought she had exhausted begin to well up again. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because honor demands it." Naalnish reached into a leather pouch at his waist and withdrew something that made Eleanor gasp. It was James's pocket watch, the one she'd given him for their first anniversary, the one she'd thought lost forever. "He carried this. I took it from his body." The confession hung in the air between them like smoke. Eleanor stared at the watch, its familiar silver surface reflecting the lantern light. "You came to return it, and to offer what your people call an apology." Naalnish extended the watch toward her. "Your husband was a good man who died because of my people's anger. The arrows were penance, protection for one who deserved better." Eleanor took the watch with trembling fingers. The metal was warm from being carried close to Naalnish's body, and she could feel the familiar weight of it in her palm. "This must have been difficult for you coming here, admitting this. A warrior who cannot face his mistakes is no warrior at all." They stood in silence for several minutes, the weight of loss and regret settling around them like dust. Eleanor found herself studying the Apache warrior's face, seeing not the savage monster she'd been taught to fear, but a man carrying his own burden of grief and honor. "The townspeople," she said finally. "They're organizing a hunting party. They want to find whoever placed the arrows." Naalnish nodded. "I know. I have been watching them. Your sheriff is a man who mistakes cruelty for strength." "You should leave," Eleanor said urgently. "If they find you here, they will not find me unless I wish to be found." There was no boast in his voice, just quiet certainty. "But I thank you for the warning." He turned to go, then paused at the barn door. "Your husband's death brought no honor to my people. Some of us remember that not all whites are our enemies, just as not all Apaches are yours." "What's your name?" Eleanor called out as he stepped into the pre-dawn darkness. "Naalnish," he replied. "It means he who listens." "Eleanor Morrison." He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect. "Eleanor Morrison, who honors the dead and treats enemies with dignity. Your husband chose his woman well, and then he was gone, melding into the darkness so completely that Eleanor might have thought she'd dreamed the entire encounter, if not for the pocket watch still warm in her palm. As the first rays of sunlight began to creep across the desert, Eleanor wound the watch and held it to her ear. Its familiar tick seemed to carry James's voice across the months since his death, reminding her that understanding could bloom even on ground watered with blood and tears. But she also knew that what had happened in her barn would be seen as betrayal by her own people. Sheriff Bradley and his men wouldn't understand or care about Apache concepts of honor and penance. They would see only an enemy who had somehow gotten close enough to kill her, and her failure to raise an alarm. Eleanor closed her eyes and made a decision that would change everything. She would tell no one about Naalnish's visit. Some truths were too dangerous to share, especially when they challenged everything people wanted to believe about their enemies. The sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. Somewhere out there, an Apache warrior was making his way back to his people, carrying the knowledge that peace might be possible between two worlds that seemed destined for war. And in her barn, surrounded by 300 arrows that had once formed a circle of protection around her husband's grave, Eleanor Morrison clutched a pocket watch and wondered if healing could begin with understanding, even when that understanding came from the most unlikely source. Sheriff Bradley's posse returned to Tombstone 3 days later, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim with failure. They'd scoured the desert for any sign of Apache presence, following false trails and chasing shadows until their water ran low and their tempers ran high. The only thing they'd accomplished was to confirm what everyone already feared, The Apaches could move through their territory like ghosts, invisible and untouchable. Eleanor watched from her ranch as the defeated men rode past on their way back to town. She recognized most of them, neighbors who'd once helped with her harvest, men who'd tipped their hats to her at church socials. Now they looked at her property with suspicious eyes, as if her ranch had somehow become contaminated by its proximity to Apache territory. That evening, as Eleanor was feeding her chickens, she heard the sound of approaching horses. Doc Hayes rode into her yard with Maria Santos, the Mexican-American woman who ran the general store with her husband. Both looked troubled, their usual friendly demeanor replaced by something more urgent. "Eleanor," Doc Hayes called out as he dismounted. "We need to talk." Eleanor set down her feed bucket and wiped her hands on her apron. "What's wrong?" Maria glanced nervously toward the desert. "There's talk in town, bad talk, about you and what happened at the cemetery." "What kind of talk?" Doc Hayes removed his hat and ran his fingers through his thinning hair. "Some folks are saying it's mighty strange that Apaches would put arrows around James's grave without touching any of the others. They're wondering if maybe you know more about it than you're letting on." Eleanor felt ice form in her stomach, despite the desert heat. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Maria stepped closer, her dark eyes searching Eleanor's face. "My husband saw you talking to that Apache boy 3 years ago, the one James helped. He saw you bring him food, sit with him while he recovered. Some people remember that now." "James helped a sick child," Eleanor said firmly. "That's what decent people do." "Decent people also report when Apaches come calling," Doc Hayes said gently. "Eleanor, if you know something about who placed those arrows, you need to tell the sheriff. People are scared, and scared people do dangerous things." Eleanor looked between her two visitors, people she'd considered friends. She could see the doubt in their eyes, the way they held themselves ready to step back if needed. The weight of James's pocket watch, hidden in her apron pocket, felt heavy as stone. "I don't know anything about the arrows," she lied, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "I was as surprised as anyone to find them there." Maria's expression softened slightly. "Eleanor, we're not your enemies, but Sheriff Bradley is asking questions, and some of the men from the posse are saying things that worry me. They're talking about search parties, about checking every ranch and homestead for signs of Apache contact." "Let them search," Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt. "They won't find anything." After Doc Hayes and Maria left, Eleanor paced her small house like a caged animal. She'd hidden the arrows in her root cellar, wrapped in canvas and buried beneath sacks of potatoes. James's watch was safely tucked away in her jewelry box, but evidence wasn't the only thing that could condemn her. Her own face might betray her if Bradley questioned her directly. The next morning brought unwelcome visitors. Eleanor was hanging laundry when she saw the dust cloud approaching from town. Sheriff Bradley rode at the head of a group of 6 men, their faces set with grim purpose. Eleanor's hands trembled as she hung the last sheet, but she forced herself to maintain an appearance of calm. "Morning, Eleanor," Bradley said as he dismounted. His tone was deceptively casual, but his eyes were hard as flint. "Hope you don't mind us paying a visit." "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" "Well, we've been thinking about them arrows around James's grave, trying to figure out why Apaches would show such particular interest in your husband's resting place." Bradley walked closer, his spurs jingling with each step. "You got any thoughts on that?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "None at all. Like I told Doc Hayes, I was as surprised as anyone." "Were you now?" Bradley's smile was cold as winter wind. "See, that's curious, because Pete here says he saw you talking to that Apache boy a few years back, says you seemed mighty friendly with him." Pete Garrison stepped forward, his merchant's face flushed with nervous excitement. "She fed him with her own hands, Sheriff. Sat with him like he was family or something." "That boy was dying," Eleanor said firmly. "James couldn't stand to watch any creature suffer, human or otherwise. I was simply helping my husband show Christian charity." "Christian charity?" Matthews repeated mockingly. "That what they're calling it now?" Eleanor felt anger rising in her chest, hot and dangerous. "What exactly are you accusing me of, Sheriff?" "Nothing yet," Bradley said, "but I'd like to take a look around if you don't mind, just to satisfy the folks in town that everything's on the up and up." It wasn't really a request, and they all knew it. Eleanor nodded curtly. "Search wherever you like. You won't find anything." For the next hour, Bradley's men went through her house and outbuildings with the thoroughness of men convinced they would find evidence of treachery. They overturned furniture, dumped out drawers, and searched every corner of her barn. Eleanor watched with growing dread as they approached the root cellar, but they found nothing more suspicious than her winter stores of vegetables and preserves. "Satisfied?" Eleanor asked when they finally regrouped in her yard. Bradley studied her face intently. "For now. But Eleanor, I want you to understand something. This territory's on the edge of war. We can't afford to have folks who might be sympathetic to the Apache cause. And what exactly would that mean for someone who was sympathetic?" "Well," Bradley said slowly, "that would depend on just how sympathetic they were. Someone who just felt sorry for them might get by with a warning. Someone who was actively helping them, that would be a different matter entirely." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Eleanor understood perfectly. Any hint of contact with Apaches would mark her as a traitor, subject to the harsh frontier justice that made no distinction between guilt and suspicion. After the men left, Eleanor sat on her porch and watched the sun set over the desert. Somewhere out there, Naalnish was probably watching the town, trying to gauge the level of threat. She wondered if he understood how precarious both their positions had become. As if summoned by her thoughts, she heard the soft whistle that had become their signal. Naalnish emerged from the shadows near her barn, moving with his usual silent grace. But something was different about him tonight. His posture spoke of urgency, even alarm. "You must leave this place," he said without preamble. "Tonight." Eleanor stood slowly. "What's happened?" "Bradley's men are not the only ones searching. Some of my own people have seen our meeting. They believe you are a spy gathering information about Apache movements." Naalnish's face was grim in the fading light. "There will be a council tomorrow night. They will decide what to do about the white woman who talks with Apache warriors." Eleanor felt the world tilt around her. She was caught between two peoples trusted by neither, her very existence a threat to both. "Where would I go?" "There is a place," Naalnish said. "A hidden canyon 2 days' ride north. Mexican traders use it sometimes. You could be safe there until tensions cool. And if they don't cool," Naalnish was quiet for a long moment, "then we will both be outcasts, belonging to neither world." Eleanor looked at her ranch, the home she'd built with James, the life they'd created together. Everything she had, everything she was tied to this place. But staying might mean death for both her and the Apache warrior, who'd shown her that enemies could become something more complex than simple hatred. "How long do I have to decide?" "Until the moon sets. After that, both our peoples will be hunting for answers we cannot give them." As Naalnish melted back into the darkness, Eleanor stood alone on her porch, caught between two worlds that had no place for someone who dared to see their enemies as human beings. The choice before her would define not just her survival, but her very identity in a land where understanding was often mistaken for betrayal. Eleanor stood in her darkened house, a single candle flickering on the kitchen table as she made the hardest decision of her life. Her few precious belongings lay scattered before her: James's pocket watch, their wedding photograph, her mother's Bible, and a small bag of silver coins hidden beneath the floorboards. Everything else, the furniture they'd built together, the dishes they'd eaten from, the bed where they'd shared their dreams, would have to be left behind. The moon was already beginning its descent toward the western horizon when she heard the soft whistle from the barn. Eleanor blew out the candle, shouldered her pack, and stepped into the night that would either save her life or mark the end of everything she'd ever known. Naalnish waited with 2 horses, her own mare and a sturdy Apache pony. His face was painted with war colors, she noticed, black and red stripes across his cheeks that made him look like the savage warrior the townspeople feared. But his eyes, when they met hers, held the same quiet intensity she'd come to recognize. "You decided to come," he said, and she heard relief in his voice. "I decided I'd rather die free than live as a prisoner of other people's hatred." Eleanor secured her pack to her mare's saddle. "What about you? Won't your people track you?" "They will try." Naalnish swung onto his pony with fluid grace. "But they taught me to track and hunt. They also taught me to disappear." They rode north through the desert darkness, following game trails and dry washes that would hide their tracks. Eleanor had lived in this territory for 6 years, but Naalnish led her through landscapes she'd never seen, places where red rock formations created natural mazes and hidden passages. The desert that had always seemed hostile and empty revealed itself as a place of secret beauty and ancient wisdom. As dawn approached, they climbed into higher country where pine trees began to dot the landscape and the air carried the scent of snow from distant peaks. Eleanor's mare was breathing hard when Naalnish finally called a halt near a natural rock shelter. "We rest here," he said, dismounting and leading his pony into the shade. "Tonight we reach the canyon." Eleanor slid from her saddle, her legs stiff from the long ride. "Naalnish, what happens if we're caught? Your people will hang you as a traitor. Mine will kill you as a spy." His voice was matter-of-fact, but his eyes were gentle. "And both will kill me for breaking the laws that keep our peoples apart. Then why are you doing this? You could have just disappeared, left me to face whatever came." Naalnish was quiet for a long moment, staring out across the desert they'd just crossed. "Your husband saved my nephew's life, but more than that, he treated him as he would treat any child, with kindness, without condition. That is rare in this world, Eleanor Morrison. Your husband planted seeds of peace in ground that everyone said could only grow hatred. And now we are those seeds, trying to grow in hostile soil." Naalnish looked at her directly. "Perhaps we will take root, perhaps we will die, but we will not bend to the wind that tells us enemies cannot become friends." They slept fitfully in the shade of the rocks, taking turns keeping watch. Eleanor's dreams were filled with images of her burning ranch and Sheriff Bradley's cold smile. She woke to find Naalnish studying the southern horizon through a small brass spyglass. "What do you see?" "Dust. Riders. Your sheriff is more persistent than I expected." Naalnish collapsed the spyglass and tucked it away. "We must move now, while we still have the advantage of higher ground." The afternoon became a deadly game of cat and mouse across the high desert. Eleanor could see the dust cloud behind them growing closer, could sometimes catch the glint of sunlight on metal that meant guns and badges. But Naalnish led them through country that seemed impossible to traverse, up cliff faces where the horses had to scramble like mountain goats, through narrow canyons where the walls closed in so tight she could touch both sides with outstretched arms. As the sun began to set, they crested a ridge, and Eleanor gasped at what lay below. A hidden canyon stretched before them, its walls painted in bands of red and gold that caught the dying light like stained glass. A stream ran along the canyon floor, and she could see the green of cottonwood trees and grass that spoke of year-round water. "The place of peaceful waters," Naalnish said. "Mexican traders named it El Refugio, the refuge. Apache, Mexican, and sometimes even white men have found safety here when the world became too dangerous." They descended into the canyon as full darkness settled over the desert. Near the stream, Eleanor could see the remains of old campfires and temporary shelters, evidence of the many people who had sought sanctuary in this hidden place. It felt ancient and sacred, a pocket of neutrality in a land divided by hatred and suspicion. Naalnish helped her unsaddle the horses and set up a simple camp near the water. For the first time in days, Eleanor felt her shoulders relax. They had made it. Whatever came next, they had found safety, at least for now. "Will they find us here?" she asked as they sat by a small fire, sharing jerky and hardtack from Naalnish's supplies. "Perhaps. Bradley is determined, and he has good trackers. But this place has hidden many people over the years. The canyon has secrets." Eleanor looked around at the towering walls that surrounded them, at the stars beginning to appear in the narrow strip of sky above. What kind of secrets? Hidden passages. Ways in and out that are not obvious to strangers. Water sources that can sustain people for months if necessary. Naalnish poked at the fire with a stick. "And something else. This place changes people. Those who come here fleeing hatred often leave it behind." "You mean we might not be the only ones?" "There are others. Not many, but some. People who found that the lines between Apache and Mexican and white matter less than the lines between decent human beings and those who choose cruelty." Naalnish's eyes reflected the firelight. "Perhaps we will meet them. Perhaps we will learn that the world is larger than the small corners where we were born." Eleanor pulled James's pocket watch from her pack and checked the time. Back in Tombstone, people would be discovering her empty house, her abandoned ranch. They would curse her as a traitor and a coward. But sitting here beside the gentle stream, watching the firelight play across Naalnish's weathered face, she felt something she hadn't experienced since James's death. Hope. "I don't regret coming," she said quietly. "Even though you have lost everything." Eleanor considered this. Her house, her belongings, her place in the only community she'd known, all gone. But she'd also lost the weight of other people's expectations, the burden of pretending to hate someone she'd come to respect. "I haven't lost everything," she said finally. "I've lost the things that were keeping me from discovering who I really am." Naalnish smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "Your husband would be proud of the woman you have become." As the fire burned down to embers and the canyon settled into peaceful silence, Eleanor Morrison and Naalnish sat companionably by the stream, two people who had crossed every line their societies had drawn, two enemies who had chosen understanding over hatred. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new tests of their unlikely alliance. But tonight, in the place of peaceful waters, they had found something rarer than gold in the Wild West, proof that human decency could transcend the artificial boundaries of race and culture, that enemies could become allies, and that sometimes the only way to truly honor the dead was to choose life and hope over vengeance and despair. In the distance, barely audible over the murmur of the stream, came the sound of voices. Other refugees, other seekers of sanctuary, other people who had learned that the world was too complex for simple hatreds. Eleanor and Naalnish exchanged glances and rose to meet whatever new possibilities the canyon might offer. Their story was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning.